The year is 1776. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, submits his first draft of the document to the Continental Congress for approval. In it, he accuses King George III of abuses of power that justify the American people forming their own nation to protect their rights. Included in that list of abuses is the following condemnation of slavery in America. King George III has waged cruel war against human nature itself. He has stopped every attempt to prohibit or to restrain the disgusting business of slavery. He is determined to keep open a market where men are bought and sold. Jefferson, a slave owner himself, felt strongly about condemning slavery, but the Continental Congress had it immediately removed before unanimously passing the Declaration. The question to ask would be, why did this happen?
Let's define slavery. Slavery is a system under which people are treated as property and are forced to work. The slave trade was protected by law in America until 1865. Slaves were brought from Africa against their will through the Middle Passage of the triangular trade route.
The Middle Passage was a horrific way of delivering slaves to the New World. Slaves would be packed below decks on huge ships in spaces about 3 feet by 3 feet. Many slaves died of disease or committed suicide along the route. So why were Africans enslaved in America? The reason is because slaves provided a free labor force to the agricultural South.
As the number of indentured servants shrank, slaves replaced them. The plantation cash crop Southern economy required many field hands.
With slaves declared property and property protected by law in America, the number of slaves in the Southern colonies soared.
So let's look back at the history of slavery in America and see how the numbers grow. In 1690, there were 13,000 slaves. In 1750, the number had risen to 200,000.
1790, as cotton became a more popular crop, the number soars to 700,000. And then, in 1820, 1.5 million slaves worked the fields in America.
So what was life like for an African slave? African slaves were victims of terrible atrocities. They were sold at auction, inspected like cattle.
Many times, families were torn apart, children from mothers, husbands from wives, and they suffered severe beatings from their masters. Slavery was an issue that deeply divided the states in early American history.
In northern states, slavery was used much less. They tended to see it as cruel, and they supported its abolition.
In southern and western states, slavery was crucial to their plantation economy. They saw it as part of their livelihood, and they fought strongly to maintain its legality.
Slavery also divided the people themselves. Abolitionists wanted to end slavery forever in America based on moral beliefs and human rights. Famous abolitionists include William Lloyd Garrison, the author of the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator, and Frederick Douglass, a freed slave who was also an abolitionist speaker.
Slave owners were people who saw abolition as an attack on their property rights, their livelihood, and themselves. One of the most famous slave owners of the era was the Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun. He once said, "Be it good or bad, slavery has grown up with our society and institutions, and is so interwoven with them that to destroy it would be to destroy us as a people." Famous examples of the fight amongst the people over the issue of slavery include the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was run by Harriet Tubman, and it was a network that helped fugitive slaves escape north.
The next example is the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, the daughter of a slave owner who was able to see the atrocities of slavery herself. The novel was a critique of slavery and caused outrage in society.
Bleeding Kansas. When Kansas became a territory, there was an election among the people whether or not to allow slavery. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery mobs killed each other in the streets over who would control the territory.
And finally, John Brown. John Brown led a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. This raid was intended to arm slaves in order to create an uprising in the South.
As the decades went on and new states were added to the American nation, an issue arose over representation in Congress. Slavery began to divide the government. At the heart of the issue was the Congress itself and the issue of equal representation between slave states and free states. Here's how it worked. In the Congress, let's say free states had 5 representatives, and slave states also had 5 representatives. The free states feared that if the slave states got a majority in the Congress, they would pass a law that would forever allow legal slavery. The slave states feared that if the free states got a majority, they would pass a law that would forever outlaw slavery. Every time a new state was added, that state would gain representatives in the Congress, putting one side at a majority over the other. In order to appease the other side, a new state would have to be added in order to balance the power. This would preserve the Union and keep it from falling into civil war, while at the same time balancing power between free states and slave states in the Congress. Slavery was an issue that so divided the people in the states that whenever a new state was to be admitted to the Union, compromises were needed to stave off civil war and preserve the Union. The first such compromise was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. In it, Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state. To keep the balance of power in Congress, Maine was admitted as a free state. All future territories to the west would be divided along the 3630 line. South of that line, slavery would be allowed. North of that line, slavery would be illegal.
The Compromise of 1850. California was admitted as a free state. New Mexico and Utah were able to decide for themselves whether they wanted to have slavery or not. This is called popular sovereignty.
The last compromise is known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Two new territories in the West, the Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory, were voting in free elections whether or not to allow slavery in their territories. In Nebraska, they voted to outlaw slavery, and in Kansas, the people voted to allow slavery. So why does this matter? From 1861 to 1865, the United States engaged in a great civil war. Hundreds of thousands of men lost their lives in defense of their cause. More Americans died during the Civil War than all other American wars combined in history. The war, which was fought between the North and the South, was partially over the issue of slavery. And there are political, cultural, social, and economic effects of the Civil War that we still feel today.